So here we have a mid-sagittal cut of the sheep brain. As you can see, mid-sagittal cut will separate the two cerebral hemispheres, and the corpus callosum, which is this white structure right here, allows communication between the two cerebral hemispheres. The corpus callosum has three main parts. The most dorsal part is the splenium, up at the top. As we move down the corpus callosum, we hit the body, and the lowest part of the corpus callosum is known as the genu. If we move lateral of the genu, we encounter a gyrus known as the genual gyrus. Lateral of the genual gyrus is the genual sulcus. Going back to the genu of the corpus callosum and moving ventrally, we encounter the subcallosal gyrus. If we look at the gyrus right on top of the corpus callosum, we can see the cingulate gyrus. The structure just moving down from the splenium is known as the fornix right here. Inside of the corpus callosum, we can see the lateral ventricle space. Usually there is a membrane, a thin membrane, that covers the top, and this is known as the septum pellucidum. If we were to remove the septum pellucidum, we would uncover the head of caudate structure right behind here. Going behind the fornix, we see the circular structure known as the thalamus. The center of the thalamus is known as the massa intermedia. Massa intermedia allows communication between the two thalamus within the cerebral hemispheres. If we move ventral from the thalamus, we encounter the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located between the optic chiasm, which is more anterior, and the mammillary body, which is posterior. Going back to the thalamus, we can see a dark structure just poking out. This structure is known as the choroid plexus. More will be told about the choroid plexus in a bit. If we move lateral to the thalamus, we encounter the habenula. Lateral to the habenula is the penile body. Dripping down from the penile body and a bit ventral is the posterior commissure. Moving back to the corpus callosum, the top part of the splenium, if we go behind the penile body, we can see the hippocampal formation. Going back to the penile body, if we move lateral, we can see the superior colliculus. Ventral to the superior colliculus is the inferior colliculus. Ventral to the inferior colliculus is the midbrain. If we continue to move posterior, we see a bit of a bump. This bump is an indication of the pons. Moving posterior and down the brainstem, we can see the medulla. And if we continue moving posterior, we can see the spinal cord. That concludes the mid-sagittal view of the sheep brain.
We will now take a look at the ventricles. The ventricles are the space through which the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, travels. The membrane within the corpus callosum is the septum pellucidum. Behind that membrane is a hollow space called the lateral ventricles. So locate the thalamus and go dorsal to that, which would be your third ventricle. Trace it towards the anterior to find the interventricular foramen. Beneath the inferior colliculus is the cerebral aqueduct. Ventral to the cerebellum is the fourth ventricle. The way CSF travels would be from the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle to the cerebral aqueduct and through the fourth ventricle where it exits out into the spinal canal. We will also take a look at the cerebellum from the mid-sagittal view. So trace the brain from the anterior section until you reach the cerebellum. And it has really nice cauliflower-like features, and that's food for thought. The most ventral structure at the base is the lingula. So it's ventral and anterior. So trace these structures clockwise or from the rostral section to the caudal section. So here we have the lingula, the centralis, which is like at the center, the culmen, which comes before the primary fissure. So lingula, centralis, and culmen. After the primary fissure is the simplex. The protrusion over here would be the tuber vermis. Beneath that is the pyramis, uvulus, and the nodulus. Eventually, you will reach the fourth ventricle floor. Now let's take a look at the cerebellum from the exterior view. So to distinguish which side is anterior and which side is posterior of the cerebellum, find the flocculus. So the flocculus would be the most lateral structure on the cerebellum, and see which way it's pointing towards. So as you can see, it's pointing that way to the right. So the flocculus points towards the anterior portion of the cerebellum. So right here you would have the lingula, the centralis, the culmen, and here would be your primary fissure. So once again, the lingula, centralis, and culmen, and primary fissure. Right after that would be the simplex, and the protrusion you see would be the tuber vermis. After that would be the pyramis, uvulus, and nodulus. The nodulus folds into the base of the cerebellum. So that's why when the cerebellum is attached to the rest of the brain, you cannot see the nodulus. Now locate the medial section of the cerebellum, and that would be your tuber vermis, and then move laterally. So lateral to the tuber vermis and most rostral would be the ansiform lobule. Lateral to the tuber vermis and more caudal would be your paramedian lobule. Lateral to those structures would be the paraflocculus. Lateral to that would be the flocculus. The cerebellum can also be generally divided into the anterior lobule, anterior lobe, which includes the lingula, centralis, and culmen, as well as the posterior median lobule, which includes the pyramis, uvulus, and nodulus. And that concludes PhotoSeries 3.